Good rising, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. I am Taylor Andre, Taylor Made Real Estate Easy. And today we are having an amazing conversation with a guest that we have spoken to before. And so Elizabeth Korver-Glenn is absolutely amazing. I love all that she stands for and appreciate how she shows up. She wrote the book Race Brokers, which examines the role of intermediaries in the real estate market and how they influence racial dynamics in housing. She explores how these brokers and agents facilitate or hinder access to housing for different racial groups, highlighting systematic inequalities and the implications for community segregation. And so, without any further ado, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Taylor? It's good
I
to be
am
back.
fantastic. So, first, can we please talk about this color coded note books library that you have?
Yes. So I recently moved to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which is a move home for me. I'm from North Carolina, so was very excited to move into my office this summer. And my kids helped me. They're 10 and 6. They helped me unpack all my books. And to keep them kind of invested in the process, I asked them to help me sort them by color. And then my youngest one was like, "Hey, Mom, what if we did it like a rainbow?" And so
Aw.
that's what we did. And now I love how it looks, but I can't find any of my books because I'm used to having them organized by topic, and sometimes even by authors within topic. And so now I
Mhm.
just spend like 5 or 10 minutes if I need to find a book.
But it's a great backdrop nonetheless.
Yes.
And so I know we're pressed for time, so I will jump right into it. One of my first questions is are you a real estate agent? Like what got you into wanting to observe or take a deeper dive into race relations in real estate?
Mm, that's a great question. First, no, I'm not a real estate agent. Um, I I would say I have a longstanding interest in things related to homes, in part because I have like a special attachment to the house I grew up in. But my interest really started when my husband and I bought our first house. And we bought our first house back in 2012, and it was a short sale. And so,
Mhm.
uh, as first time home buyers, everything was new to us. And at the same time, I was starting graduate school, getting my PhD in sociology. I was learning a lot about things like the history and the contemporary realities of segregation, for instance.
Mhm.
And so while I'm starting starting my career as a sociologist in graduate school, I'm also going through this process of purchasing my first home, and it just blew my mind how many people were involved in that process, right? Everybody from our real estate agent to the inspector to the appraiser to the loan officer to the underwriter, right? Like all of these people, and they all had some kind of say in whether and how our home purchase was going to proceed.
Hmm.
And at the same time, I saw that in the research about housing and about segregation in the United States, that really there was very little attention to how these what I call intermediaries, how these sort of brokers or these in betweens, not just like real estate brokers, but like anybody that goes in between, right? Any of these professionals, it really was missing in the research. So it's like a lot of the research would say like, oh yeah, of course, like before the Fair Housing Act passed in 1968, real estate agents would steer their clients to these different neighborhoods. And then it was like almost like after the passage of that legislation, then the research was like, oh, see, things are getting better. And people kind of stopped investigating like what real estate professionals are actually doing on the ground. And
Mhm.
so I became convinced that, like, oh, if we really understand how racial segregation is so persistent in American society, which it is, it's incredibly persistent, very, very durable, even with major demographic changes, then we really need to focus on who is actually doing the work of getting people into homes. And that's how I became interested. But I spent so much time with real estate agents during my research that I did start to get asked by people if I had previously been a real estate agent, or if I had some kind of like family connection to like real estate brokers or whatever. And my answer is no. I think I just, because I was spending so much time, I started to kind of maybe pick up some of the affect or something of the real estate agents.
Can you share how policies like redlining and racial covenants affected the housing patterns in the past, and how those patterns are still felt today?
Sure. So redlining is now a much more, I think, common term for folks. But just to make sure that we're on the same page with any of your audience, redlining is a term, a colloquial term that really refers to the sort of collection of practices in the like mid 1930s all the way through 1968 to the Fair Housing Act, where the federal government, local governments, and real estate industries all really intentionally and explicitly work together to ensure that white neighborhoods remained the highest value and that white people only had access to them, and that neighborhoods of color were devalued, and that home buyers and home sellers of color were essentially like locked into those neighborhoods, right? And so these practices included things like the Homeowners Loan Corporation redlining, what we call now the redlining maps. They're these literal color-coded maps that they used to help train people like mortgage loan officers and appraisers for how to actually interpret home values in different areas of each city across the United States. So the green areas were coded grade A. These were the white and affluent areas. They were seen as low risk. And then you had grades B, C, and D, and grade D neighborhoods were color coded red. These were low income neighborhoods or neighborhoods of color that mortgage banks and appraisers interpreted as high risk and thus refused to loan, to actually close mortgage transactions in those areas, right? And this was upheld. The Homeowners Loan Corporation was an arm of the federal government. Mm-hmm. And so, right, these practices became institutionalized across the federal government and in real estate industries as well. And there's actually it's really interesting though, because even those maps were actually just one small piece of the broader racist and classist landscape of the United States. Yeah. That they were important, but they were not the end all be all. However, there were a number of practices, including restrictive covenants, that were implemented throughout the United States that collectively had the effect of ensuring that white homeowners and white residents of white neighborhoods were able to retain and increase their material worth, for instance, through wealth accumulation through the sale of their properties, while residents and homeowners in neighborhoods of color were routinely denied those opportunities, and their equity in their homes was devalued, such that their wealth accumulation often became like wealth loss, actually. And so we still see those patterns manifested today. We know that white households in the United States have wealth that is almost 10 times the wealth of many other groups of color, right? In particular, Black and Latinx groups. In fact, I think it's even higher. I don't have the exact number right now, but it's a lot of that wealth inequality, right, comes from these practices that establish the intergenerational transmission of white families' value, specifically through their property, and families of color are devalued through the devaluation of their property across generations.
So, for those who did not hear that, I would like to summarize. You do not live in a ghetto. Where you live was predetermined by the federal government for these homes, Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, and whatever those similar cities are in your state. That's on purpose. When we talk about this, and have like this idea of, you live over there because you're poor. Um, how does that play a role in appraisals? How does that play a role in the value of my house in a Mattapan versus a home in Newton where there's a single family um, cul-de-sac that was built in 1970s?
Right. Oof. You know what? It's heavy and it's hard. And this is something that I have done a lot of research on, and have also gotten a lot of pushback on from specifically from appraisers. But the research that I have done has shown that appraisal logic and methods, right? Like how appraisers are actually trained to arrive at their opinions of value for single family homes, continues to be implicitly and sometimes explicitly informed by racist understandings of neighborhoods. Um, and this is this is true. This is true for the interviews I have conducted with appraisers who have told me about how they go about appraising home value, and this is also borne out in the national quantitative research that I've done with Dr. Junia Howell, where we have found that not only are homes in white neighborhoods appraised at significantly higher values than comparable homes in otherwise comparable neighborhoods of color, but that inequality has actually increased over time, net of historical effects like redlining. And so, of course, like this has some serious implications for how people live their lives, right? Like if you're trying to refinance your house and your house and you've done improvements on it, there's story after story of this, right? Like you've put in so much equity into your house, you're trying to refinance it, and then your appraisal comes in lower than what you know it's worth. What do you do, right? Whereas if you're in a white neighborhood and you do the same thing, you improve your house, you go through all this like blood, sweat, and tears, equity, all that, and then you try to refinance and you're able to. Well, I mean, we all like I assume like your audience knows like what kind of advantages that can provide, right? To people, right? And so we're talking about like financing kids' education. We're talking about financial stability during medical crises. We're talking about continuing ed. We're talking about being able to make more improvements to the house, right? Like, there's so many ways that this continues to affect people's daily lives, and that this inequality in appraisal methods and logic, for me, is one of the primary drivers of ongoing various other forms of racial inequality in our country, including wealth inequality.
Wealth inequality, I'm glad you stopped there. Can we for a second talk about the economic divide? How have these policies created or exacerbated the economic divide? And if you could pretend to have the answer, what would it look like if that injustice didn't take place?
Well, I guess I'll just kind of double down on the wealth inequality here, which is, the way that our government has structured home ownership is, at least historically, has intended it to be this engine of wealth generation, right? Specifically, from its inception, this was intended to be an engine of wealth generation for white families. And through the myriad processes, both historical and contemporary, of excluding families of color from accessing either homeownership or, once entering into homeownership, equal valuation of their homes compared to comparable homes in white neighborhoods, that wealth gap persists. And actually, in recent decades, in the wake of the Great Recession and the housing crisis between 2008 2010, we actually saw another increase in wealth inequality between white families and Black and Latinx families. So that economic divide is real, and it is affecting how people are able to just live their lives. We now are in the midst of another affordable housing crisis, where many Americans, not only low income families, but also lower middle income, even middle income families, depending on the metro area, are rent or housing cost burdened, right? Like they are paying more than a third, in many cases, more than half of their income on their housing. And so in this scenario where we have housing unaffordability, which my co-author and colleague, Dr. Junior Howell, has argued specifically is related to the hypervaluation of homes in white neighborhoods. It's like almost an impossible cycle to break out of, right? If I can't afford to even like pay my rent this month, how am I going to be able to afford a down payment for a house? If I'm able to afford a down payment for a house, but I'm trapped in, like these higher interest rates, how am I going to afford to save up money to like improve my house? So there's all these kinds of ongoing cascading effects for this economic divide. In terms of waving the magic wand, I am a good sociologist, and by that I mean I have to work with what I'm given, and sadly, I don't see that there is a magic wand. However, I do think that there are a number of both conceptual and actual policy related things that I think could make a big difference. One is that I think that maybe there should be some reconsideration of I routinely hear this, we need to create more opportunities for families of color to become homeowners. Like, great, wonderful. And that cannot be done without also addressing these other issues. For instance, these valuation inequalities that have real and ongoing consequences for families of color while they continue to provide advantages for white families, right? So if we're going to advocate for homeownership, okay, well, but that also for me has to be done within the context of, then let's address some of the other mechanisms of inequality that happen once people actually enter into homeownership. Another thing that I've been thinking a lot about, but also my colleague that I've mentioned now a couple of times, Dr. Junior Howell, is actively working on, is decoupling some of the intertwined problematic ways that both she and I have found contribute to these inequalities. So for instance, she's working on actually with her organization ERUCA, which is spelled ERUKA. She's working on actually alternative models for appraising homes that do not pin the home's value on the sort of the racial composition or the economic composition of the surrounding area, but instead on the home's characteristics, right? And that's greatly simplified, but like she's the one doing the work. So if y'all are interested, you can go check it out. But really starting to get at some of the sort of the problematic ways that home value is intertwined with these very entrenched ideas and very entrenched methods of evaluation that take the racial composition of the neighborhood into account. So those are some ideas we have that we've talked about in other formats as well. I personally would like to see our government get behind some ideas for wealth generation that
not this administration.
I mean, you said magic wand, yeah, like I would long term love to see some alternative ideas for wealth generation and how we can encourage and enable people to actually become financially stable and independent that don't necessarily hinge on this thing that's out of reach for so many Americans now, which is home ownership.
So let me play devil's advocate for a minute, right?
Yeah.
And so like slavery was over years ago. Okay. Jim Crow no longer exists. I bust my ass and I go to work every day and I still have high interest rates and I still have struggle saving money, and I still made it happen and pulled myself up by the bootstraps and bought a house. Why do you think other people should be able to have access to something that I don't have access to because of something that happened 50 years ago, 60 years ago?
Well, to the devil's advocate, I would say that I actually think that the research shows that people don't actually pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Most often, people are still relying on some form of help from others. So we know that, for instance, white home buyers routinely receive financial gifts from their relatively more wealthy family members, even if they themselves are a low income. So for instance, like I'm a case in point, like when my spouse and I bought our first house, both of us came from families that were poor families, like in terms of our parents did not have money to support us at all. And so when we purchased our first house, we bought it for $88,000 after scrimping and saving for, a long time, to get that tiny little down payment. But the house was falling apart. We didn't have the capital to fix it up ourselves. So my husband's grandmother gave us a very, very low interest loan to be able to fix the house up. And so we did, right? And that's not pulling yourselves up by the bootstraps. That's relying on your social network to provide the aid that you need. And we know that through the research that happens over and over and over again especially among white families who are advantaged by these intergenerational wealth transmissions, especially when we think about like how white families were able to access homeownership and accrue wealth in ways that families of color were not able to do throughout the 20th century. The other thing I would say is that still today, no, we don't have some forms of slavery, although I will say that there are a number of scholars working on the criminal legal system who have drawn attention to how maybe there's some modern forms of slavery, for instance, like unpaid labor amongst prisoners who are forced to work for no pay. And sure, we don't have Jim Crow laws on the books anymore. That does not actually mean that there aren't still a number of both institutional and individual level forms of racism that still continue to exclude people of color from even accessing these opportunities, even if they've been able to save up, even if they've been able to rely on like financial gifts from family or friends, or even if all these other things, right? Even in the research I've done, even these relatively wealthier families of color are routinely literally locked out of homes. Like I had one Black real estate agent that I interviewed as part of my book project, who described how one of her wealthy Black home buying clients went to go look at a house. They had made an appointment in advance and so on, right? Like did all the right things, checked all the boxes. And when they got there, the listing agent literally locked the door in their face, wouldn't let them in, right? So even if somebody plays by the rules, does all the right things, actually the American housing market is predicated on ensuring that white people have access to homes and value, while families of color are routinely blocked out of and pushed into other alternative opportunities that will not bring the same sort of economic gains or to them as their white counterparts.
So I want to be respectful of your time.
Yeah.
And
I do have to go in 5 minutes.
No, I'm going to let you go in 3.
Okay. Great.
First of all, can we continue this conversation at a later date?
Sure. Yeah.
And do you plan on doing additional research in this field, in real estate specifically?
So I am, but coming at it from a different angle. So right now I'm working on getting a new project off the ground where I'm working with Dr. Sophia Locklear, who's a sociologist and professor at the University of Toronto. And we are focusing on a group that many sociologists have ignored, and that is urban Indigenous residents and their experiences of navigating the housing market. And we are asking them about their experiences working with real estate agents and mortgage lenders. We're asking them about their experiences getting into housing. And so we'll be coming from the more of the consumer angle, right? To understand how this group, which is very marginalized in American society, has attempted to navigate the housing market in ways that may be different from other groups. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Last question.
Yeah.
As a real estate agent, it would be beside me for me not to ask. What type of disparities do we see between agents of color and non-melanated agents?
Mm-hmm. Great question. I've done a little bit of research on this as well. The one thing is that often white agents are able to work with primarily white clients, in some cases, like only white clients. And those white clients live in, guess what? White neighborhoods, which are higher value. And real estate commission, as we know historically, is based on the percentage of the home's sales price, right? And so white agents are routinely advantaged economically because they are receiving the benefit of the doubt from the white clients, right, who want to work with them. Meanwhile, agents of color tend to be kind of pushed into or try to find niches working with with clients of color who, guess what, tend to live in neighborhoods of color where their homes are valued less. And so the agent's pay is also less. So that's one dynamic that I have investigated and found to be true. And then another dynamic is also that real estate agents of color are routinely also locked out of opportunities or blocked from accessing opportunities to, for instance, network with developers who might want to work with white real estate agents instead. I observed this firsthand in my research where one client of color that I knew, or not one client, one agent of color that I observed in my fieldwork had actually been told that by a specific housing developer that he would refuse to work with him if he wouldn't do it. And then this also the same agent of color was actually at an open house for one of the houses that he had listed, and a neighbor called the cops on him, and he had to go and prove that he was like a like an actual real estate agent that was supposed to be there, right? So real estate agents of color are also facing these immense, not only economic inequalities compared to their white counterparts, but they're also routinely experiencing this, what we might call everyday racism, right? From both developers, which has also economic implications for their livelihood, but also from other actors like neighbors or police officers or what have you. So yeah, there's a tremendous amount of inequality amongst agents as well.
I thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you. And I look forward to continuing this conversation when we have the ability to do so.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Always.
All right. Bye.
So I'm the biggest fan. I love the book. I read the book, and from reading the book, I was like, I need to speak with her. And so
thank you for reading my book.
Of course. And so Elizabeth, please go ahead, log off. I know you have to run, but for those that are watching, today was just a snippet and a glimpse of more to come. I want you to understand not just how to make real estate easy, how to get you into a home, but why you currently live in the conditions that you live. And I think it's important for you to understand the history. So in the book, Finally Home, the step-by-step guide for people preparing for first-time home ownership, the first chapter is literally a timeline of why real estate looks the way it does across America. And it gives you a better understanding of who we are as American and who harmed us the most when it comes to economic inequalities regarding housing. If it's something that you're interested in, the book can be found on the website. It's on Amazon. It's in bookstores in Massachusetts. I pop the trunk. I have them in my car. So if you see me, I thank you. I love you. I appreciate you. I hope you guys have an amazing day. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you for breaking down for us why we have such an economic divide in regards to housing. And she had to squeeze us in today. I'm glad we were able to have the time that we did, but I will definitely work on bringing her back. And if you have questions that we were unable to ask today, slide in the DM and I will make sure that they are asked in the future.